is this going to be a drama video? Don't like drama videos. God, those are ass, man. Hello everyone, welcome back. We are gonna do a case study review for general paper. In other words, we're going deep dive into an example and then we'll flesh out all the details, to help you understand it so that you can use it in your general paper essays or AQs. And this is a follow-up to, the video that we did on how to build examples. So if you haven't really seen that yet and you require some context, do go and watch that first and then you can always come back to this. Now, what I'm about to say may get me into a lot of trouble or it may be a blessing in disguise. Honestly, I don't know. In all likelihood, though, no one's gonna give a shit. So oh well, here we go. So one of the interesting ongoing conversations in Singapore as of filming/writing this around end March 2025 is related to tuition advertising methods. Here's the thing. Singapore's tuition industry is worth $1.8 billion as of 2023. Needless to say, relative to the size of Singapore's economy, it may not be the biggest, unlike say finance, 14.3% of nominal 2024 GDP, manufacturing, which was 17.3% of the same parameters, or wholesale trade, 20.3%. However, in an economy with a real GDP of about 561 billion USD in 2024, the value of the tuition industry is substantial enough to warrant attention and even possibly scrutiny. Its presence in the economy notwithstanding, the main thing that's really up for discussion should be the implications of this industry on Singaporean society as a whole. However, since an analysis of the entire industry as a whole is too much to cover in one sitting, we will focus on the salient discussion right now, which is tuition advertising methods. So what's the fuss all about? Now, just a disclaimer, I'm a tutor myself. I run my own tuition center and it's a for-profit business. I decided to make this video to achieve a couple of things. Number one, most importantly, I hope that this video would help you analyze this particular issue so that you can use it for general paper or your English essays. The other thing also is that hopefully it may shed some light on the tuition industry as a whole, as well as tuition advertising methods, and give a little bit more context for what it's worth. But since I'm a tutor who's running his own business, I'll urge you to take everything I say with a grain of salt, because for transparency, creating this video isn't just for the sake of expressing my arguments and analysis, but full disclosure, it also carries some self-interests because it is also meant to get views and it is a way for me to create content to market my own business. So yeah, whatever that I say, take it with a grain of salt. That being said, this is also a great exercise for H2 history students. So after you watch this, check your provenance, right? Check your sources. Is this source reliable? Well, that's up for you to judge for yourself. Okay, here we go. So before we delve into this case study, as with all case studies, we want to have some, basic preliminary questions to ask ourselves. You may expect the same questions to be asked over and over again as we cover more case studies. Number one, what happened? This is where we need to clarify the facts of the case. In other words, we want to find out what happened, who's involved, who are the stakeholders that are involved, etc., etc. Basic facts, in short. Number two, what are the impacts? This is pretty much self-explanatory, but it will build on the previous question. So after you find out what happened, and from there you start to analyze what all these impacts are. Number three, why is it a problem? Again, this builds on the previous bit about the impacts, because the impacts often are related to the problem in itself. If let's say we are analyzing a case study whereby we are trying to find out what is the issue. And finally, how did this happen? So this is where we investigate the causal events or factors that led to the situation on hand. Beginning with the first question, what happened? So for some context, the Education Minister, Chan Chun Sing, did an interview with Channel News Asia recently and very publicly and directly called out tuition centers that are employing questionable, direct targeted advertising methods on kids and parents. Specifically, they cited an case at a primary school earlier this year. There were people essentially distributing flyers to primary 1 students on the very first day of school, imploring them to sign up for tuition. This was also brought up in Parliament earlier this year, early 2025, by Member of Parliament Liang Yinghua. When the school in question found out about this and caught wind of this, the principal came out and stopped the flyer distribution process. So in that interview with Channel News Asia, Minister Chan goes on to talk about a few more things aside from the flyer distribution. His main grievances, as raised in the video, can be summed up as such. Number one, the flyer distribution itself. Number two, tuition centers advertising their services using cherry-picked student results. Number three, advertising using student endorsements, especially, through paid endorsements. These, broadly speaking, are the things that warrant discussion. If you want the details of what he actually said, I'll urge you to go and watch the CNA interview. And now we look at the specific context of tuition advertising methods. Now, I haven't seen any of the ads myself, so I can't definitively say that the following details will be on those ads. But there will inevitably be a few messages that will be sprinkled throughout the advertisements that, tuition centers typically send out. These messages will invariably be built upon the previous one, in order to create this overarching argument. And the messages typically go like this. Number one, academics in SG, Singapore, is very, very tough and competitive. As a result, students fall behind. In a way, that's true. But that brings us to the next message. Therefore, the students that fall behind require help, and tuition centers can give you that help. Following that, the next message would typically be things like, our tutors churn out high A rates and they are trained by MOE. And this is where, they would bring in all the different qualifications. I have a degree in this, master's in that, years of experience. I have a postgraduate diploma in education from NIE. How many percentage of my students get A's in this year or that year? And then using all these details as basis, they create labels like come experience lessons by master tutors. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, okay, so this is just a quick side rant, right? Mind you, even teachers don't call themselves master teachers, okay? And yes, there are such official titles in the Ministry of Education, but they are typically given to teachers who teach teachers. So in other words, it's kind of like, when you read mangas or watch animes, there's that crazy old man who's secretly super powerful. That's what the master teachers are. And even then, very, very experienced teachers don't call themselves master teachers. Tutors call themselves master tutors so that they can masturbate. The next part of the message would typically go like this. Our lessons are fun. We have plenty of snacks and drinks. We bring our students to USS, especially those that do well, right? Or for parents, you can win a gift, let's say a luxury handbag, if you sign up with us for a certain number of months or even years. Most importantly, by we, I mean the tuition centers, get you the grades. And finally, the last bit of the message would be typically a call to action. Sign up now, capitalize on our early bird promos, etc., etc., contact info, socials. Now, as someone who has worked for other tuition centers and who is currently a tutor himself and who runs his own tuition center, there are a couple of things that I would like to add on. Aside from these flyers, right, there are also other ways that tuition centers typically use to reach out to potential students or parents. Some methods include, number one, free foolscap pads. So these are foolscap pads customized with iconography that's related to the subjects that they teach, or they are just foolscap pads emblazoned with the logos of all these centers. And within the cover pages of these foolscap pads, there'll be all the aforementioned advertising details that I mentioned earlier. Number two, free crash courses. These are meant to give prospective students a taste of the center's lessons. And the crash courses would typically take place, either at the beginning of the school year, so January or February, during the March holidays as well, or they may take place during the June holidays or even the September holidays, especially for students that are a year below their graduating years. This would be the P5 students, or the Sec 3 students, or JC1 students. That in itself is fine. But the problem is that once these students are hooked, the centers would then give an elevator pitch, in terms of why the students should sign up with them, and more importantly, why they should sign up now, NOW, using tactics that would typically stoke the students' fears and anxiety. And the third method would be, free bubble tea and food stuff. So it happens in such a way whereby the centers will advertise on their socials. Okay, at this school, right? We're going to head down to your school, tag 5 friends, get them to follow us, have them tag another 5 more friends, follow our Insta or TikTok or whatever. And if we have a large enough response, we'll be giving out free bubble tea before your school begins. So like before the first lesson and before flag raising and all that stuff. So just a little punch in. When I was filming the video, all the examples of marketing methods and advertising methods that I stated, that I raised, I guess, that tuition centers did were based on personal experience, i.e. I've seen, actual tuition centers do all these things, but I've looked deeper into it and it turns out things are worse than ever before because it gets truly quite scummy. First of all, there are some tuition centers that are just straight up using a pyramid scheme whereby they have their students refer other students to their tuition center and then they advertise very proudly, hey, this particular student referred this number of students to us. He or she has earned over $1,000 so far. Wouldn't I mean that's bad enough already? But things get worse when you go into social media because then that's where you really see things get truly quite screwed up. Because then you have all these shorts and videos on places like TikTok or Instagram, where they, let's just call it what it is. They set up a honey trap. So they get a pretty girl to shoot like, videos of really useless stuff that's not related to tuition, like simple trivia shit, like, hey, how many oceans are there on Earth, right? And then that's supposed to be a reflection of good geography tuition lessons. I'm just stating an example. I mean, for fuck's sake, you're running a tuition center. Why do you need to do a honey trap? Why do you need to do a thirst trap? What sort of message are you sending? Seriously, what the hell are you doing? Make better decisions. Jesus Christ. So what this is meant to do is to artificially boost organic growth of their socials and therefore their outreach. And if it sounds paradoxical, yes, it is. Above all, really, this isn't anything new. It's been going on for more than a decade now. It just so happens that conversations surrounding our society's plans to progress our education system demands a deeper look at this issue because this issue runs contrary to the aims and the goals of our education system today. So what are the impacts of all these advertising methods? Minister Chan has already, briefly mentioned some of them, but I think it bears repeating and fleshing out. The first impact is obviously FOMO. So the messages within these ads, they create a lot of anxiety, which compels parents to sign their kids up for tuition. Money in the bank for them because, for better or for worse, anxiety, or even worse, fear, is a major motivator. So that's the most immediately obvious impact that comes from this sort of advertising methods. Number two, it entrenches a particular mindset, like what Minister Chan said. So in order to clarify this further, I suspect what he's trying to say is this. It's very subtle, but the advertising of all these tuition centers, right, they compel a lot of emphasis on the results of, so by results, I mean exam results, obviously, rather than the spirit and joy of learning, which is what MOE is trying to cultivate, or rather, which is what MOE is particularly emphasizing on today. This is as the tuition centers, advertisements, messages, right? All the ads that they create focus on what grades students can score, after they sign up for the tuition lessons, but not so much what they can, or if you're a student watching this, what you can or what you should learn. The next thing is the removal of choice. So this comes from the manufactured anxiety. Because parents get anxious about their kids' academic performance, they force their kids to go for tuition, even if they don't necessarily need it. More insidiously, they force their kids to overly emphasize on weaker subjects without actually further cultivating their interest in the subjects in which they are strong. So in essence, better results or better grade average across the board comes at the expense of the joy of learning. I mean, it's typical, isn't it? Like, you like subjects in which you have an interest, in which you do well. The next impact, optics. So the thing is that with flyer distribution, with the face-to-face distribution of marketing collaterals, nothing incites more FOMO than seeing someone buy into it. I kind of put it in this way. If, let's say, you're in a supermarket, right, and then you see someone giving out free samples of a new product, and then you see someone else trying it and then going like, and yeah, that might cause you to be like, hey, what's that thing? Let's go and find out what it is. Am I missing out on something that might be potentially phenomenal? And it's the same thing because when students or parents accept all these marketing freebies or advertisements, an impression is made on not just them, but the people surrounding them. And resultantly, a sense of intrigue is created. Is it for something exclusive or prestigious? Like an A-star tuition center or something like that. And then for other prospective students or parents who may not have gotten the freebies or the, whatever collaterals that these tuition centers were distributing, they may see that and then worry that I need it. And then we are back to the first impact of FOMO. The end result is that students will be stuck in this never-ending cycle of anxiety. Not doing well enough in your school or for your academics, go for tuition. Tuition not helping, go for the branded centers, the ones that claim that they can produce all of these results. But is that really the ideal of education towards which we should strive as a society? And keep in mind, all of these impacts that I've just talked about are only related to flyer distribution. Advertising method 2, students cherry picking. Okay, so for the second method, how it works is this. Tuition centers will provide statistics on the number of students that have, achieved the distinction rate or merit rate after experiencing their lessons. They will then take these stats and then slap it onto their advertisements, right? Their marketing collaterals, and then put it on their socials and put it on their website. How many percent of my students got A's, blah, 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 things like that. Granted, it looks great because it creates this veneer of excellence and legitimacy, because after all, stats don't lie. But let's look beneath the surface. The stats don't include a range of years. So what that means is that, is it only for this past year, or is it for all years of operation? Number 2, they don't include sample size. So how many students did they survey? How many students did they include in this supposed, pool of students that got 95% A rates? Number 3, are they students who joined up with, whatever tuition program it is for the entire duration of that program, or is it for the entire duration of their academic career phase? Or do they also include students who join up, I don't know, let's say in September, 2 months before your A levels or a month before your O levels? And I guess September, that will be PSLE, right? So those who join up in August, a month before PSLE. And finally, do they include students who did not do well? And are these statistics vetted by an independent third party to ensure their veracity? The crucial point is this: the source and parameters of these stats are opaque, and because of that, they cannot be verified, and we'll just have to take their word for it. So let me give you a personal anecdote as an example, right? Speaking as a tutor myself. Last year in 2024, I had 11 JC2 H2 history students. So they are a mixture of those who are doing the new syllabus 9174 and those who did the old syllabus 9752. So I had a total of 11 students that I saw through the A levels, and they all joined up around in the month range of April to September. Of these 11 students, 9 got back to me with their scores. So they texted me or they called me, and of these 9, 3 got A's, 2 got C's, and the rest got B's. If we look at it in terms of distinction rate, that's about 30%. Now, a 30% A rate may not be great advertising material. And in fact, based on today's standards, no, it isn't. But it gets difficult to explain all the other contextual factors, things like weak foundations or non-existent foundations, because many of them actually were private candidates. Ground-up rebuilding of writing techniques, because perhaps they just didn't know how to express themselves. Building conceptual understanding of all the different topics, which in some cases, the schools have already helped them do it, but we are just trying to reinforce that isn't too bad. But what about those who have not touched this subject ever before? i.e. your private candidate students who are doing A levels for the very first time. And finally, clash in instruction. So the techniques that I use to teach my students may differ from the teachers, because in JC, it's not really all that standardized, right? Teachers may use certain terms, like let's say in source-based question, they might use credible instead of reliable, whereas I might use reliable instead of credible. And then that might confuse the students, because then they will wonder, okay, so what the heck are you talking about? So it's things like that that we need to navigate, but it doesn't matter. Because as a potential customer, who the hell wants to read a detailed analysis of like why I did not manage to push 100% of my students towards an A grade? You wouldn't be interested in that. And even if I were to put myself in the shoes of my customers, I'll be like, no, that's too long-winded, man. Jeez, just what the hell? Seriously. So what can I do? I can game the stats. If I add the A's and B's together, that's 7 out of 9 students that got A's and B's. That's a 77% rate, to be more specific. So I take this stat and then I market it as such. And that obfuscates, like, the number of students that actually got A's and those that actually got B's. Or what I can do is I mix these numbers with my overall track record. So because the thing is that in all my years of tutoring, I've always been averaging these numbers. Sometimes I might get more students that achieved a B. Sometimes I might get more students that achieved an A. But the overall average for both A's and B's would always be about 75 to 80%. So I'll just round it up And then I'll say, oh, come for my lessons. 80% of my students get A's and B's. Come join TDE for tuition. Apropos of this, I'll need to touch on the third method here before we discuss the collective impacts of these two methods. And the third method, actually, or rather, the third complaint that was raised by Minister Chan is that tuition centers are getting their students to endorse their products. Now, how does that work? I think we all know how that works, but just to flesh it out a little bit more. Typically, they'll collect a testimonial from a student and use it in their advertisements. Now, first, I just want to point out, reviews on their own are not inherently wrong, nor are they inherently bad. Because after all, tuition centers or tutors are themselves still businesses. In fact, having reviews is critical because it helps parents and potential students, but especially parents, make an informed decision before they buy into the service. It's the same, right? Before you purchase any sort of product, you will want to look for reviews, to understand whether or not that product may suit your needs. And such reviews or testimonials give hints on the tutor or the tuition center's teaching methods and what they, the prospective students, stand to gain in return for the fees that their parents pay. The trouble comes, however, if the tuition center pays their students to endorse these services. This means, once again, cherry-picking students who did well in the N, O, or A levels and have them write a glowing review of the tuition center. And of course, where these reviews end up is dependent on what ads they put out. But it typically appears in YouTube ads, flyers, website, so on and so forth, with a picture of the student saying something like, I went through this tuition and I got an A, therefore you should attend their lessons. Minister Chan further expounds upon this by stating that some tuition centers not only cherry-pick which students to showcase, they even cherry-pick the students that they teach. The idea is simple. Tuition centers may reject some students on a few bases. Number one, their results are not great and it is difficult to improve their marks due to their very weak foundations. Number two, their needs may be higher, especially if they are students who require access arrangements, or if they decide to look for tuition in, say, the second half of the year in their graduating year. So, for instance, last year, before I had 2 more new students join me in September, their parents, both of them, they asked me very different questions in terms of like what I do and all that. But the one common question that they asked was, do you still accept students at this time of the year? I'm worried for my kid. I'm not going to give the gender so as not to expose them. I'm worried for my kid. And the thing is, some of the other tuition centers are not accepting my students. Now, of course, there can be deeper conversations, right, to be had regarding AA students, especially if one is not trained to deal with such cases, because, there can be certain legitimate concerns like access-friendly facilities, teaching methods, pedagogy, how to engage or relate with them, so on and so forth. And tutors, they may not have as robust a system as the public education system, nor the equipment, nor the know-how to deal with such things, although we should definitely learn more about it. But the thing is that often, for the other cases, the rejection stems from, aside from a lack of vacancy, which is fine, there is a desire to ensure a consistent sample size of students that they know will do well or that have been with that particular tuition center for a while. And above all, this creates plausible deniability for them so that they can use that to boost the stats of their students' results, right? So what do I mean by plausible deniability? In short, they can say that, I did not accept this particular student, and that is because we don't have any vacancy. But that student, in reality, can still receive the help that they need, but the tuition centers may not choose to provide that help, because if that student gets less than ideal result, right, then it will harm the overall stats of that tuition center itself. So in rejecting that student, then the tuition centers can effectively wash their hands off of the responsibility of helping that student, whoever she or he may be. But teachers can't do this. In the public education system, they cannot choose who they teach. Now, what are the impacts of, cherry-picking students? The most obvious impact would be the almost deceptive style of advertising. So the tuition centers may not necessarily be churning out, all these results at these rates that they claim, but they advertise themselves as such anyway. So invariably, the veneer of legitimacy would cause students to sign up. Now, granted, if the center cannot actually produce results, right, customers would be able to smell the bullshit coming from a mile away, so they wouldn't get students anyway, or at least they wouldn't be able to get the students to stay on for the long term. The branded centers, on the other hand, would be able to produce all these results. But there we have to ask further questions. Do the results come from actual learning, Or is it just the verbal diarrhea or regurgitation of model essays or answers? Does any learning even take place? Number two, there is an inherent conflict of interests. In paying for the reviews, the ex-students that endorse, the service have no choice but to say something positive about it. Here's the thing. I also ask my students and the parents of my students for reviews. The thing is that it's entirely voluntary and they may or may not give it. Most of the time, they don't, right? Because they tend to forget or they just don't want to get their name out there, which is fine, which is fine. In fact, that's all the more where we should respect their wishes, right? We can only ask it as a favor. But I suspect even then, for the students that decided to drop a review for my tuition center, on, let's say, for instance, I guess that's the only platform I use, on Google profiles, they would already feel obligated to say something nice. But the thing is that if there are financial incentives, I imagine that that sort of feeling will be even worse because they're paid to give a 5-star review. This brings me to the next thing, which, in my opinion, is the biggest and yet most subtle problem. To be fair, Minister Chan already raised this, but again, I just want to expound a little bit on it. The thing is this, in getting students to advertise for them, or, cherry-picking the students' stats or cherry-picking the students themselves, this in turn creates the optics that tutors are better than teachers in schools. So here's the thing, we often forget tutors tute, teachers teach, from the ground up. So unless the student is a private candidate with no prior experience in any MOE school whatsoever, but aside from all these kinds of private candidates who seek help from tuition centers, because for whatever administrative reason, they may not be able to rejoin a school. The thing is that teachers in schools have to do the painstaking work of setting the context for learning and introducing all these complex concepts to all these other students. So to illustrate what I'm talking about, let me put it this way. If let's say you are in secondary school and then you go for science tuition, you already know what cells are. You know the parts of a cell. You know how they work. Or at the very least, your teachers might have beaten into you the definitions of all these things. Or from an even more fundamental sort of level, you may have forgotten all these definitions and certainly your tutors might help in helping you recall all these definitions, like what is a cell wall, what is cytoplasm, or the mitochondria, right? Things like that, okay? Or the nucleus, so on and so forth. But who's the one that introduced this very concept of cells being the most basic unit of life to you? Is it the tutor? I don't think so. So the point I'm trying to make is this, and certainly what Minister Chan said as well, tutors pick up on all this prior knowledge, for which they do not need to instill because it's been done by teachers in school already, and the students have already learned it in school. And then tutors claim the credit for the students' academic success. So the trouble is that this particular situation, right, of tutors claiming full credit for their students' accomplishments encourages a bad impression of the teachers in school. Let me expound a little bit more. This is particularly insidious because any tutor with a lick of logic would not boldly claim in their advertising that they are better than MOE teachers. But this situation creates that view implicitly, and it further suggests that the school as an institution is lacking, and ipso facto, tuition is necessary. But the thing is that, now don't get me wrong, I'm not against tuition. I mean, clearly, because I'm a tutor myself. Tuition can certainly help. I did well for my science subjects in when I was still a secondary school student because I had help from my tutor. Now, not to discredit my teachers, they were great, right? I distinctly remember that my chemistry teacher was particularly kick-ass. She was so good as a teacher. But here's the thing, she was also our school's vice principal. So yeah, she was a great teacher, but it was difficult to get consult timings with her because, well, she was the goddamn vice principal. So I consulted my tutor, right? And I had help there. But here's the critical thing. She didn't and she wouldn't claim full credit, even though I would certainly give her a lot of credit for the grades that I got in secondary school. And okay, yeah, before you get all your pitchforks out, I'm also in no way suggesting that all tutors do this. Some tutors do it to help, right? Albeit for a fair price. Some just want to teach outside the confines of the ministry. Nor am I saying that all teachers are definitely good. There are some who do it purely for the iron rice bowl. Some are more concerned with career advancement than actually teaching. And unfortunately, bless them, some just can't teach. So objectively, there will always be people who may not be the very best at what they do. And when it comes to tutoring, I would put myself in that category. because teaching is difficult, contrary to what people actually believe. But if such things continue to occur, then this feeds further into the entrenched mindset that tuition is absolutely necessary for academic success in Singapore. Worst of all, I've even personally interacted with tutors who actually bought into their own hype. I've heard these words verbatim. Okay, so just for a little bit of context, once I was contacted by another tutor, not gonna say his name, but he's one of the bigger tutors out there, okay, for a particular subject. I'm not gonna say what subject that is. And he called me discussing a potential collaboration. And this was, I think, 4 or 5 years back. And when I explained that, oh, I already was working with this other tutor, then he said, oh, that guy, I know him. I have more students than him. Ha 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 ha. Now, that obviously left a very bad taste in my mouth, but I was just, okay, sure. And another one that I've heard recently, okay, from somebody that I've collaborated with before. Oh, don't believe me? Go ask your teachers for their A rates, like the number of students that they managed to help get their A grades in the A levels, and compare with my A rates. We'll see who has higher A rates. Okay, aside from all these things, it also places undue pressures on teachers. Here's the thing, because of this mindset, okay, that maybe sometimes tutors can be better than teachers, parents would have higher expectations of teachers and then start to demand a lot more from them. For instance, why is my kid not doing well in school? Is it you? Are you slacking on your instruction? Why are you not giving more homework? Blah, 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 blah. You know, those nightmare parent scenario that Minister Chan have to phrase in very, very diplomatic terms, but I'll just come right out and say it. All the parents that are giving all the teachers crap for not understanding what's going on, unless there's a legitimate situation, of course. But here's the thing. Teachers also have plenty of things to attend to, like CCA administration, school committee work, admin duties, parent relations, event planning. And you know what? I haven't even mentioned teaching and learning yet. But the most visible thing that we will all focus on would be results. And I guess in a way that's natural, right? Or at least natural relative to us. We shouldn't want that. So, why is this a problem? And what are the general impact? In answering the question of why this whole tuition advertising methods thing is a problem, we need to look at the more general societal impacts of this phenomenon. Number one, mental health. Students get more anxious, competitiveness in academics increase, students get yet more anxious, and then they begin to see academic success as the only important thing in life. They neglect real-world experience just so they can hit the books, or worse, they neglect the development of their social skills. Because then kids would just spend the whole day studying and they wouldn't go out with their friends all that much, or their parents wouldn't allow them to. They wouldn't go out and experience, let's say, hobbies and all that, because any sort of excess time that they have will be spent in a classroom like this, getting more and more tuition. And then all that's important in their life becomes their studies. Notice we didn't use the word education here. Number two, loss of purpose. So this entrenches the view that education is but a means to an end, rather than what its fundamental purpose is and should be, which is gaining knowledge and learning. Because of this view of education, students lose interest in absolutely everything, and they seek ways to study and study and study, and they become like study zombies. So the point of it then is just to get a degree so that we can get a job that does not fulfill us, but is good enough to pay the bills. Even then, there are practical concerns here, but it would be too much to cover here. Suffice to say, cultivation of a habit of learning is not meant to just be an arbitrary or altruistic sort of view of education. In fact, in today's world, it is absolutely critical because companies are demanding more of their workers while continuing to pay the same wages. But again, more on that next time. Number three, incentivization of sleazy tactics. You know, despite everything that I've said so far, no matter what, these advertising methods do bring results for the businesses. So students and parents alike, they get attracted to all these freebies or potential gains and sign up for their services. Now, as a tutor myself, you may say that, hey, you're saying all these things, you know, because sour grapes. Okay, how do I put this? I can do something that I love doing, which is teaching, and I can also criticize the sector in which I'm plying my trade. It's not mutually exclusive. And yeah, sure, I have a choice to do this as well, right? Advertise like, oh, you know, I have this sick classroom, very comfortable, you know, plenty of snacks that I'll give my students. Speaking of which, I need to top it up. So, I treat my students to nice meals afterwards. I bring them to go and eat dim sum. Blah, 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 blah. I can do all these too if I want to, but I refuse to advertise it right? Because I want my marketing to actually mean something. But these tactics brought all these different tuition centers results in the past. And therefore, they'll be incentivized to continue these methods so that they can attract the students to deal with the inevitable student churn when all these students graduate and are no longer paying for their services. And then the whole thing goes on and 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 on again. At this juncture, of course, we can ask ourselves, how did this happen? Assuming you are coming in with a blank slate, right? You can begin by asking a simple question like, why do tuition centers do this? Well, cha-ching, you blinky chumps. The most obvious answer is money. There is no denying that tutoring, if done right and with expanded operations, can be incredibly lucrative. I mean, the industry is worth $1.8 billion. So as it gets more commodified, the advertising messaging becomes increasingly refined, with the primary purpose of capturing as many students as they could over time. So it's no longer about learning, but getting you your results so that they can get themselves the business results. However, simply blaming the tuition industry for such advertising practices is way too simplistic. So let's delve a little bit deeper. So the first perspective that we can take is from the economic perspective. Let's begin with a simple question. Why do the ad strategies of compelling anxiety work so well? The first thing we can consider, obviously, are the economic needs. Singapore has developed over the years since our independence in 1965. With such development, there will inevitably be inflation of prices. So according to the EDB themselves, the Economic Development Board, the average monthly costs of living are $1,391 to $4,076 USD every month. So if we put it in SGD terms, and these are exchange rates based on 20th of March 2025, that's 1.8 Singapore dollars to about 5.4 Singapore dollars per month. Now, of course, a few caveats here, right? These numbers were crunched specifically for expats, and it doesn't account for things like, social services, government subsidies, so on and so forth for locals. These prices also include housing rental, which most Singaporeans don't actually need to pay for. So for locals, there are measures implemented by the government to help, just to name a few. Increased subsidies, especially in the aftermath of the budget 2025, which can help defray some childcare costs. BTO flats are affordable if you pool your resources together with your fiance and use your CPF to pay for it. Public education is highly subsidized, and so are higher levels of education. So at universities, if you're a local student studying at a local U, you can get subsidized rates for your, per semester tuition fees. Furthermore, of course, and I would like to urge everyone watching this to do this as well, you can certainly live way beyond your means. Sorry, way below your means, not way beyond your means. Edit. You can certainly live way below your means, right? So for the young, you can continue living with your parents and, even after you embark on your careers. In fact, you are encouraged to by the government, so it's not only due to costs of living, it's also due to you taking care of your parents. Take public transportation instead of purchasing cars. Eat at hawker centers. I would say that sounds somewhat reasonable and workable, provided if you have these few things. A university degree, so you can get. Secondly, a white-collar job at an MNC or SME that pays competitive salaries with CPF contributions. Third, a fiance, so that you can, buy a flat, right, at affordable rates. Good luck if you're on the LGBTQ spectrum, however, as marriage is defined as a bond strictly between a man and a woman under our constitution, unfortunately. And last but not least, you have a strong family unit and a great relationship with your parents, so it doesn't make you want to claw your eyes out if you continue living with them as adults. The point is, based on the above factors, things have to line up very nicely for you, right, to be able to do well economically speaking. But the thing is, life isn't that simple. They often don't. So to hedge against all these potential costs of living, right, especially if you have to go out there and rent a place on your own, you have to make sure that you get a well-paying job. It is then natural human inclination to aim for one of the top-paying jobs, and definitely more so for Singaporeans. Now, of course, the top-paying jobs depend on the current economic climate or context or trends or whatever. But some occupations consistently offer competitive wages, which, according to the Ministry of Manpower, are typically your PMET jobs, unless you become a minister. Or as they are colloquially known, doctors, lawyers, engineers. So with this context in mind then, is there really any surprise that our studies not education, studies, compel us to focus on the achievement of results to get into institutions of higher learning to pursue those degrees, right? Because let's face it, among the three occupations I just listed, doctor, lawyer, engineer, the former two require pretty much straight A's. Not only that, if you don't manage to get into local use, be prepared to shell out a certain amount of money to pursue further studies, either in private universities here locally or in universities overseas. Now, how much money is that? Well, a simple metric to use is a shit ton of money. And in such situations, who can get us our straight A's to ensure that we get into these IHLs with a fraction of the cost of private or overseas universities? Tuition. Consequently, the ads beat the drums of get good results, secure your future, sign up now, get ahead of the rest, right? Do well for your exams, blah, 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 blah. Again, I'm not victim blaming here or whatever, right? I'm not blaming parents or students for buying into these advertising practices. Certainly, we can all be more discerning consumers. That being said, we must also consider the reasons why we feel compelled to make certain choices and why our behaviors turn out in certain ways. This stems from our relationship with education itself, which it in itself, can be broadly speaking due to the Singaporean culture. And for that, we have to wind the clocks back a little bit to better understand what it is that we are dealing with here. See, to understand this, we need a brief recap of Singapore's 20th century history. After the separation from Malaysia, we were deprived of access to certain resources in Malaysia itself, in the hinterland. So we were left with, well, zero natural resources. Add to that an undeveloped economy, low education rates, and a lack of industry. That's not all, because if we go back further, we faced multiple threats in the form of cultural divides, with a spate of race riots in the 50s, Maria Hertog, in the 60s, the Padang riots, even after independence. We faced a communist threat from the Malayan Communist Party, right, and the whole Malayan emergency that occurred in both Singapore and what was known as Malaya back then. We had a conflict with Indonesia during Konfrontasi. And of course, Japan conquered us for 3 years because we did not have an army. And the Brits abandoned us during that whole, tragedy because they themselves were facing a lot of troubles in Europe. And the Japanese then decided to carry out a pogrom of the people here in Singapore. Given these historical events, right, our leaders were determined to make it work after independence. So we pursued staunch pragmatism. Government policies were not designed according to ideological lines. So it wasn't a question of, strict maintenance of democratic values, nor a turn towards authoritarianism, but rather policies were designed according to what worked within the context of what we had. And what we had, to put it simply, were a lack of a developed economy, no army, an uneducated population. So we pursued bilingualism and subsequently the ethnic integration policy, the GRC system, so on and so forth, partly to integrate the population, which is multicultural in nature, and reduce the likelihood of ethnic conflict. We opened up our economy, attracted foreign investments, and built industries to tackle our lack of natural resources with a heavy emphasis on exports. But beneath all this is the undercurrent of practicality or pragmatism. We pursued and continue to pursue practical policies that are best suited to the context of our society's needs, and also, dependent on the context of that time period in history. And over the course of 60 years up to this point, that would have inevitable influences on the psyche of our people. Pragmatism thus becomes inherent in Singaporeans in general. So in terms of what all these had to do with education and tuition, we developed our industries and we pushed our students to the appropriate level. This became imperative as our industries developed further, and then we started to shift towards value-added manufacturing and eventually a technology and knowledge-based economy. To qualify for jobs in such sectors, we needed higher levels of education. Add in all the economic factors that we just talked about earlier, right? The cost of living and all that stuff. Such education levels then become absolutely critical. So at the expense of searching for the joy of learning, we sacrifice this joy at the altar of practicality and pursue things that secure a better economic future. Whether or not that was the right thing to do, there is certainly room for debate there, but based on the sort of standards of living that we experience today, definitely have to give some credit to this pursuit. And that's what I believe is the core reason why tuition ads work so well. Capitalizing on our anxieties work precisely because of our anxieties about a potential individual future where we may be forced to take less pragmatic paths, or even worse, the difficult one. So a combination of our culture, our economic pursuits, and of course, money, 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 would thus lead to this phenomenon where tuition centers, they capitalize on our anxieties and tell us that, for a brighter future, be it an academic or an economic one, you need good results, and you can only get good results if you sign up for tuition lessons. So if you have made it to this point, well done, youth. Now, of course, you can call me out all you want, right? Because I'm a tutor myself. I've attempted such advertising methods before, albeit without much success. And if you spare me some room for self-reflection, who knows? Because if I had succeeded all those years ago, I may have just continued such methods as well, right? Because the financial incentives are just too great. But I guess we'll never know, because maybe my initial failures have given me the temerity to try a different path. And the good thing is, from my very limited sample size and brief conversations with my students and ex-students, such tactics are actually wearing out their welcome nowadays. Maybe as a society, we can then search for that better path together, right? Especially if we have an East Coast plan. Now, of course, at the end of the day, if you're still watching, right, you're talking about practicality and pragmatism, I suppose your main question will be this: how then do I apply this to my essays or AQs? Well, full transparency, again, I can't really go into these details without disclosing everything that I have to offer here. Still have to make a living. But if you're interested, we can discuss this in our lessons. So the discourse education, that's why it's called the discourse education. We discuss stuff like this. We offer lessons for general paper H2 history and secondary school EL for the O levels. For us here, we strive, well, I say us, it's just me. I strive to offer consumer-friendly lessons that are focused on you learning concepts well and, of course, applying them in the exams, because ultimately they're still needed. After all, if you can't apply these concepts on your own, it's futile, right? But we are much more focused on the former and the process of finding the answers with, of course, guidance and demonstration, rather than us, offering lessons that are marketed as, providing this magic bullet for you guys. So if you're interested, contact us for a free trial lesson. Yeah, until then, I'll see you guys at the next case study breakdown. We have one coming soon on a basic concept. I guess it's not really a case study, but us fleshing out a basic concept of governance. Do keep a lookout for that. Yeah, I'll see you guys next time.